not going to talk a lot about biology tonight, but until recently we thought of the colon as just 6 feet of tubing, and this is a slide courtesy of Alan Van Nook. We now know it's quite biologically complex tubing. We know that there are differences in the consensus transcriptional subtypes across the colon, difference in RAS mutations, and we know that on the right side there are higher rates of BRAF mutation, hypermethylation, and some different clinical features as well. Just embryologically, the left and right colon develop differently. The right colon develops from the midgut, and the left colon develops from the hindgut. So it shouldn't be surprising that we're seeing the differences that we are, but that brings us here tonight. So we now have retrospective evidence from 8 different trials, and I'm going to be going through that systematically. I'm going to go through the individual trial data. I'm going to focus on overall survival and response rate. The data on progression-free survival is included in the manuscript. And then I'm going to talk about 2 meta-analyses of the data that's been performed as well. I'm going to start right out in saying that there are a lot of limitations with this data. And just to start, it's retrospective data. There was absence of stratification for SIDE and RAS status. And that leads to imbalances between the arms in important covariates. There is variation in adjustments for those covariates between trials. Not all patients were evaluated for KRAS status. The definition of SIDE, although generally was established at the splenic flexure, there are some trials that, most notably CLGB 80405, which actually just excluded the transverse colon. And finally, some studies included analyses of BRAF and some didn't. Just the brief summary is that when BRAF was included, it didn't alter the findings. So there's no doubt that this data is subject to many limitations. However, it is the best data we have right now. And the hope is that between the collection of data, and in particular the meta-analyses that we have, that we can come to some conclusions despite these limitations. So I'm going to go through the individual trials one by one. I'm going to start with the 3 trials of first-line therapy for chemotherapy and EGFR inhibitors versus chemotherapy and bevacizumab. CLGB 80405, the largest trial. And you can see that right away, all the statistically significant results are in red. Right away, you can see the difference. On the left side, almost a 7-month improvement in overall survival with EGFR inhibitors, whereas on the right side, we see the opposite. Not statistically significant, but the opposite. And you can see the numbers are smaller on the right side, and generally it's about a 70%, 30% split. In the FIRE3 trial, very similar to 80405, statistically significant improvement in overall survival, and the magnitude of the benefits are quite striking, considering that for many years in colorectal cancer, we dealt with improvements in survival of 6 weeks, and trying to decide whether that was clinically significant. To see survival benefits of 10 months is quite striking. Again, not statistically significant on the right, but numerically, bevacizumab was higher. PEAK is a little bit of an outlier. It was the smallest trial, randomized phase 2 trial. No statistically significant improvement in left-sided tumors for EGFR inhibitors, but again, about a 10-month improvement in overall survival. In contrast to the other trials, in fact, the hazard ratio of 0.45 suggests in the PEAK trial that there was a benefit for EGFR inhibitors on the right side as well, but you can see the numbers there are quite small. I'm now going to go through the trials. All of those were first-line trials. We do also have data from multiple trials across multiple lines, and these are trials of chemotherapy and EGFR inhibitors versus chemotherapy alone. Again, all statistically significant results are in red. So starting with the CRYSTAL trial, FOLFIRINOX cetuximab, 7-month improvement in overall survival. Again, on the right, there was no difference, smaller numbers, and was not statistically significantly improved. The PRIME trial, and I think the other thing about as we go through the trials, you can see that we're seeing similar results among trials with different chemotherapy backbones and different EGFR inhibitors. Prime, almost 7-month improvement in overall survival, statistically significant on the left side with EGFR inhibitors. On the right side, no statistical significance, but the numerical benefit was for no EGFR. The 181 trial, which was a second-line trial of FOLFIRI with or without panitumumab, there was really no difference seen either on the left or right side. There was a numerical superiority for EGFR inhibitors on the right of 20.1 months versus 16.6 months, but that did not reach statistical significance. PICCOLO, which is a trial of irinotecan with or without panitumumab, and was actually included both second and third line patients. They did not provide detailed analysis. In fact, this is only available in abstract from the ESMO meeting from a few years ago. But they did a test for interaction on side in terms of how that impacted on the impact of panitumumab, and there was no impact of side. The third line trial, and this was actually the first publication that highlighted the difference between sides, and I think we have the senior author with us here tonight, Rachel Goodwin. Stephanie Brule was the first author, and this was consistent with the other trials in that it showed a statistically significant improvement in overall survival for EGFR inhibitors on the left side. The highlight in green is to show that, in fact, in CO17, again, the hazard ratio favors EGFR inhibitors also on the right side, which is not in keeping with the other trials. The hazard ratio for that was 0.66. Did not meet statistical significance, and the interesting thing was, in fact, that the progression-free survival did not show any difference between left and right side. Again, smaller numbers that we're dealing with. So I'm going to move on to the meta-analyses now, and this meta-analysis was presented originally at ESMO 2016, but it was actually just published in the Annals of Oncology last week as an advanced publication. So we are catching up a little bit with this late breaking news, but we did have the data from ESMO 2016. This meta-analysis included all of the first-line trials and the 181 trial from second line. And you can see some of this highlights some of the limitations. There was a large number of patients, over 5,700 randomized in the 6 trials included, but only 2,100 approximately were included in the meta-analysis, and that ranged between 31% and 52% of the patients. The main reasons for missing data was because the side could not be appropriately identified, or the KRAS status was not evaluated. Patients with KRAS or RAS mutation were excluded. So here's the forest plot for overall survival. And on your left, that shows that chemotherapy and anti-EGFRs are better. On your right, chemotherapy and bevacizumab are better. And you can see that in the meta-analysis of these trials, there was a statistically significant improvement in overall survival for left-sided tumors with EGFR inhibitors. The hazard ratio was 0.75, and that was statistically significant. On the right side,
was this a named patient meta-analysis? Like, how did they perform the meta-analysis?
Yeah, these were not individual patient meta-analyses, no. Yeah, and I'm happy, I'm just going to go through the data, and I'm happy to answer any questions of clarification at the end. But this was, none of these were individual patient meta-analyses. So yet another limitation, but on the right side, highlighted in orange, there was really no difference between arms. The hazard ratio was 1.12, and the p-value was not significant. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about tests of interaction. This is not on how you get along with other. There's one of my new favorite Raptors, go Raptors, Serge Ibaka, punching a player in the face. He obviously doesn't interact very well. But, and many of you are familiar with this, but I'm going to be going through a number of tests of interaction. So to compare treatment effects in subgroups, and really left and right is one important subgroup, such as by side, a test of interaction should be used. Even if it looks to the observer, the two treatment effects look very different, the test of interaction may not be significant. If the interaction test isn't significant, there's no observable subgroup effect. On the other hand, if it's significant, that suggests there is a difference between the subgroups. So in this meta-analysis, they did do a test of interaction by side, And in this meta-analysis, there was statistically significant signs of interaction between left and right side. The ratio was 1.5, and that was p-value less than 0.001. In the Arnold meta-analysis, they did a number of sensitivity analyses. They excluded the phase 2 PEAK study, and they excluded the second-line 181 study that we talked about. And when they did that, there were similar results for all of the key endpoints: overall survival, progression-free survival, and response rate. They then did another subset analysis based on the type of EGFR inhibitor used. So now we're in a subset analysis of a meta-analysis based on retrospective data with all of the limitations that we've already discussed. So we're going further and further out on the limb here, but this was one of the things that was in the paper that wasn't presented at ESMO last year, and it's interesting data. We can discuss it though more during the discussion. So when they looked at cetuximab, you can see that when they compared left versus right and the hazard ratio for interaction of left versus right, it was statistically significant. When they looked at panitumumab, again left versus right, there was no statistically significant interaction between left and right for panitumumab. And what that meant overall, in this overall test of interaction, and the subset they're looking at for this test of interaction is actually between cetuximab and panitumumab, that was statistically significant. So in this subset analysis of the meta-analysis, there did appear to be a difference in that cetuximab did show a statistically significant difference between sides and panitumumab did not. We can discuss this more in the discussion. They then looked at the bevacizumab subset analysis, and they looked at, in the trials where bevacizumab was included, there was a statistically significant p-value for the hazard ratio of interaction, which means that there was a difference between sides in the trials that included bevacizumab. For the trials that did not include bevacizumab, the p-value for interaction was not significant. So for the trials that did not include bevacizumab, there was no interaction between side. They then looked at the overall interaction. So this is for trials that included bevacizumab versus trials that didn't include bevacizumab. The p-value was not significant, suggesting there was no effect of whether bevacizumab was included or not. While I'm talking about bevacizumab, there have been a few retrospective analyses of bevacizumab trials. The first was in JNCI, and they did not publish detailed information like we have here. But just suffice it to say, in this trial, they looked at the 6.6 trial, FOLFOX or CAPOX with or without bevacizumab, and the Hurwitz trial, IFL with or without bevacizumab. And when they did the test for interaction, there was no impact by side. They also looked at the first-line capecitabine with or without bevacizumab trial. This was from ESMO 2014. And in this trial, side had no impact. So that's consistent with the subgroup analysis that with bevacizumab, there does not appear to be an impact by side from the trials that have been looked at. Again, retrospective data. The second meta-analysis I'm going to talk about is the Holtz trial. This was published also in 2017. And this meta-analysis is really focusing on the first-line trials. And it looked at the first-line trials of EGFR inhibitors versus bevacizumab, and the trials of chemotherapy with or without EGFR inhibitor that we've talked about previously. So I'm going to go through now the forest plots. Again, on your left, those forest plots going to the left, it favors chemotherapy and anti-EGFR agents, and on your right, it favors chemotherapy alone. So for the PRIME and CRYSTAL trials, when the data for that was combined, the hazard ratio was 0.69, and that was statistically significant. On left-sided colorectal cancers, consistent with what we saw in the individual trials, that there is a significant benefit for EGFR inhibitors for left-sided colon cancers. On right-sided colorectal cancers, for chemotherapy with or without EGFR agents, there was no difference. Hazard ratio was 0.96, and that was not statistically significant. They then looked at the 3 trials of chemo and EGFR inhibitors versus chemo and bevacizumab. And on the left-sided, for left-sided colorectal cancer, there was a statistically significant benefit. Again, as we've seen in the individual trials, the hazard ratio was 0.71, and that was statistically significant for benefit of chemotherapy and EGFR inhibitors over chemotherapy and bevacizumab. For right-sided colorectal cancers, for overall survival, the hazard ratio was 1.3, which favors bevacizumab, but that was not statistically significant. However, the progression-free survival analysis for this analysis for right-sided colorectal cancers for progression-free survival was statistically significant, suggesting that, in fact, for progression-free survival, bevacizumab had a higher progression-free survival than EGFR inhibitors. Holch did tests of interaction by side for each of these 2 groups. For chemotherapy with or without EGFR inhibitors, the test of interaction by side was not statistically significant. There was a smaller number of patients, and this could just be an issue of power, but it was not statistically significant. The more importantly, though, the more relevant comparison, because we use bevacizumab as our standard first-line therapy, the test of interaction by side for chemotherapy and EGFR inhibitors versus chemotherapy and bevacizumab, the test of interaction for that was statistically significant, suggesting there was a differential benefit for EGFR inhibitors by side in that comparison. I'm going to talk briefly about response rates because this was somewhat surprising when we saw the data. Unlike overall survival, and for the most part it's progression-free survival, the differential benefit that we saw doesn't appear to be as strong here. On the left side, we can see that if you look throughout these trials that we've been discussing tonight, and we have data for, EGFR inhibitor response rates are always higher than bevacizumab or no EGFR inhibitor. But the interesting thing is that on the right side, the same pattern holds out, that the response rate is higher for EGFR inhibitors on the right side as well. Now, those are just the raw numbers, but these were also looked at in the meta-analysis, and in the Arnold meta-analysis. On the left side, highlighted in red here, the data showed that the response rates were higher for EGFR inhibitors, hazard ratio of 2.12. In the orange, it's highlighted for right side, and you can see that it still favors anti-EGFR inhibitors. The hazard ratio is 1.47. It was not statistically significant. Smaller number of trials, but when they did the test for interaction for this, there was no interaction, suggesting that unlike for overall survival, there's no differential benefit between right-sided and left-sided tumors for response rate. In fact, that the response rates are higher for EGFR inhibitors on both sides. I won't spend too much time, but the Holch meta-analysis basically showed the same thing in that for left-sided colorectal cancer, again on your right, this now favors anti-EGFR, and that was statistically significant. On the right, for right-sided colorectal cancers, and this is for chemo EGFR versus chemotherapy and Bev, again, the hazard ratio was 1.2. That favored anti-EGFR agents, but that was not statistically significant. Again, the test of interaction was not statistically significant, suggesting that there was no differential benefit for the EGFR arms. And the same, I won't go through this in detail, but the same patterns were seen for chemo and EGFR versus chemo alone, and the test of interaction was not statistically significant. So to summarize the data, we'll go through a line by line, and then I'm happy to take any questions of clarification. For first line, for left-sided tumors, retrospective analyses of 4 of 5 trials show a statistically significant overall survival benefit of chemotherapy combined with an EGFR inhibitor, whether that's compared to chemotherapy with bevacizumab or chemotherapy alone. 2 meta-analyses, including one including only first-line studies, have confirmed this finding. Tests for interaction in both meta-analyses showed a differential benefit for EGFR inhibitors based on side. The Holch meta-analysis interaction test was only significant for chemo EGFR versus chemo Bev, but that's the most clinically relevant. In these analyses, the benefit of anti-EGFR treatment in left-sided tumors appears to be consistent whether or not BEV is used, and regardless of the chemotherapy backbone used. A subset analysis of one meta-analysis showed that this benefit was restricted to cetuximab. We can discuss that more when we get into the discussion period. For right-sided tumors, retrospective analysis of individual trials did not show a statistically significant difference in overall survival benefit for chemo and EGFR inhibitors compared to chemo alone or chemo and bevacizumab. In the meta-analysis of first-line trials comparing chemo and EGFR to chemotherapy and bevacizumab, chemotherapy and bevacizumab actually resulted in a statistically significant benefit in progression-free survival, but not overall survival. In second line, data on the use of EGFR inhibitors in the second line did not demonstrate improvement in outcomes based on primary tumor location. The analysis in PICCOLO trial did not find that tumor side was predictive of treatment with panitumumab, and the 181 trial did not demonstrate statistically significant differences between FOLFIRI and panitumumab or FOLFIRI alone in right or left-sided tumors. In third line, the analysis of primary tumor location from the CO17 trial showed that patients with left-sided tumors definitely benefit from cetuximab compared to best supportive care. And although not statistically significant, patients with right-sided tumors did achieve a 3-month improvement in overall survival with cetuximab as well. However, there was no difference in progression-free survival. Finally, in terms of response rate, in contrast to the differential benefits of EGFR inhibitors by side for overall survival, EGFR inhibitors appear to produce a superior overall response rate in both left and right-sided cancers, as shown by the meta-analyses by Holch et al. And the pooled analysis by Arnold et al. This was not statistically significant on the right. There was no statistically significant interaction between primary tumor location and response rate in either meta-analysis.